I just want you to know that if I get nervous, I'm going to go back to the lectern. I promised my husband I was going to stand out. So can we just take one moment to take some deep breaths and set our intention for today? So let's take a deep breath, hold it, and just think about all the good things that you want to happen today, and then I'll tell you when to release. Ready? Breathe in. Set your intention for an amazing day and weekend. And now breathe out. Thank you. So hi y'all. I'm Amanda Enayati, and you might notice that my last name rhymes with anxiety. And the writer in me thinks that there's some kind of foreshadowing in that. And the ex-lawyer in me is like, bitch, please, it's an Iranian last name. I want to start by telling you about some unfortunate rats, lab rats. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman discovered a phenomenon that he called learned helplessness. Across a series of experiments with both humans and animals, Seligman and his colleagues found that if you subject an organism to painful stimuli over which it has no control and can't escape, eventually that test subject stops trying to avoid the pain. It becomes helpless and resigned. It stops trying to take any action to change its circumstances, no matter how painful that situation is. In fact, the test subject does nothing even when there's a way out, even when there's an opportunity to escape the pain. But Seligman noticed something else that was really interesting. About a third of the test subjects who experienced inescapable, painful stimuli never became helpless. They just never became helpless. They continued trying to escape their plight with their last dying breath. Now, this really piqued Seligman's interest. What was it, he wanted to find out, that made that third of the test subjects never give up? And he identified the variable as a form of post-traumatic growth. Now, let me tell you a little bit about post-traumatic growth. The human response to adversity is about bell-shaped. When things go wrong, roughly a third of us never escape, we never recover, we're done, we're broken for the rest of our lives. About a third in the middle go roughly back to where we were before the traumatic event happened, within a few months, give or take. And then there's a third on the other end of the spectrum that not only recovers and goes back to where they were before, they actually catapult to new heights. They flourish beyond anyone's imagination as a direct result of the traumatic event. Now, Seligman, who up until then had been studying learned helplessness, went on to make a career out of studying this third of the population. These people who experience post-traumatic growth and flourishing. What's different about this third of the population who actually experiences post-traumatic growth? Their particular gift happens at the level of perception. They definitely tend to be optimists. They see setbacks and bad events as transient and temporary and changeable. In other words, they tell really good stories about what has happened to them, what is happening to them, and where it might lead them. So today I want to tell you about stress and resilience and the conditions under which people flourish during really, really difficult times, which no one here can relate to, right? The difficult times. But first, I want to take a few minutes to just tell you a little bit about my own history, because the late-stage cancer was just one part of it, believe it or not. I'm basically Waldo in the Where's Waldo of stressful life circumstances. I always joke that I came to America having lived 3 lives, and then while I was here, I lived another 5. And in one of my earliest lives, I was a child refugee who had to flee my country because there was a revolution raging on the streets. I left Iran on the last one of the last normal flights out of the country. And my parents couldn't leave because they were on some lists, so I had to leave alone. And over the next 5 years, I lived in a handful of countries. I skipped between relatives and schools and boarding schools. I learned 3 languages. A couple of them I had to learn in 3 months or less because I had to go to school. Now, people always ask me if this was traumatic. In the moment when I was in it, it didn't feel that way at all. It just felt like an adventure in an otherwise normal, ordinary life. So eventually my parents got out. We all settled in the US, in LA, along with about 1 million other Iranians who were also fleeing the regime. And LA was really hard for me. We lived on the west side where not too many people looked like me, and the kids in my school never quite let me forget that. So I arrived in LA straddling 3 cultures. I was Middle Eastern, I was European, I was American, I was all of those things, but I was also none of those things. And I wasn't alone, of course, because there was a whole generation of us misfits. Our Western culture told us to be yourself and follow your dreams, and our Eastern culture, voiced mainly by our parents, told us to be yourself as long as that self is a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. And don't embarrass me, is what I heard all the time. So I escaped to the East Coast rather quickly as I could. And frankly, I loved it there. I found my home in communities of Black and brown women in whose faces I saw versions and possibilities of myself and what I could do and what I might do. I found belonging, and I really flourished for the first time since I got to the States. I went to law school in DC, and I don't quite know why law school. I guess it seemed like as good an option as any at the time. I kept telling myself that I was going to practice civil rights and human rights law as an attorney. The reality is civil rights and human rights law firms don't recruit on campus, but major law firms do, and I had student loans and had my share of high paying big firm offers, and so I took one. So I had actually really enjoyed law school. It had been a blast, but I hated being a lawyer. And the only thing that I can really tell you about my years as a practicing attorney, well, really all you need to know is that attorneys have some of the highest rates of addiction and depression of any profession, and they have the 4th most suicides by profession. I was a capable lawyer, but I was a most unhappy and reluctant one, and I felt that my mind was numbing by the day. So, in 2000, my then boyfriend, Jaime, and I left DC, and we moved to New York. He got a job at MTV, and I had been a consultant for the World Bank at that point. My work was pretty portable. And a year later, I was living in Lower Manhattan when one morning, just having finished walking my dogs, I found myself standing with my fellow New Yorkers on 6th and Bleecker, 20 blocks away, with a direct and horrifying view of the Twin Towers as they collapsed. And the only thing I remember about that morning was, as we were all standing there with our mouths open, I remember saying, "Did everyone get out?" And of course they didn't. So weirdly, 9/11 triggered a post-traumatic stress reaction in me. In some really devastating ways, it felt like revolutionary Iran all over again. In downtown Manhattan, it seemed like every light pole and wall was covered with flyers asking if we had seen someone who was missing. There were people wearing surgical masks. Everyone and everything was gritty. The air was chalky. We were breathing pulverized buildings and people for weeks. But I got through it, eventually, as one does. Remember our bell curve of adversity from earlier? So, Jaime and I got married. We moved uptown. A few years later, we had a couple of kids, a couple of native New Yorkers. And when the kids were 1 and 2, we had just moved to the Bay Area when 6 years, almost to the month, the towers fell. I was diagnosed with cancer. So, y'all, cancer was my brick wall. Because as much as I had been a walking disaster all of my life, I had never thought until I was diagnosed with cancer that I was actually going to die. Things had been precarious a lot, yes, but did I ever actually think I was going to die? No. Have you ever done one of those writing exercises where they tell you to imagine what people will have said about you at your funeral? I remember sitting there one day and actually thinking about that and thinking that it might be a reality within the year. And it was such a hell of a thing to go through that exercise for real, in real life. So the tumor was massive. It had spread undetected because I'd been pregnant and the tumor was growing in a flat sheet instead of a lump. And what the doctors were telling me was that I had an ugly, ugly prognosis. There's this thing they do with cancer called staging. They take a number of factors associated with your illness, and they tell you what your odds are at a year, at 2 years, at 5 years, and then whether you're going to be around at 5 years. I had something like a 70-something chance of recurrence by year 1, and an almost definite chance of recurrence by year 2. And I don't want to tell you what they told me my survival odds were at year 5. So the bottom line was that even with surgery and high-dose chemo and radiation, all of which I had, I was just screwed. And the thing is, I felt cheated. I had no family history. I had no risk factors. I had made assumptions about my health. I was as fit and healthy as you can get, except for the part where I was going to die from this tumor. It was just a hell of a thing to hear and bear. And here I was in my 30s with a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old staring at death's door. And it was truly my dark night of the soul. So, I lost something like 15 pounds in that first week after I was diagnosed. I just couldn't even eat. And I couldn't sleep at night. I'd been a great sleeper when everyone else was sleeping. So I started researching and reading, because what do lawyers do well? We research really well. So I became a researching beast. I started scouring every source that I could find, looking for people's stories about having outlived cancer diagnoses. And then once I had done as much as I could there, I went even broader and I started looking for stories about people who had survived all sorts of serious diseases, not just cancer. I looked at everything I could put my hands on. I'm talking blogs and library books and websites and YouTube videos, watched movies. I knew a couple of people who had been diagnosed with really advanced cancers back in the 1980s and the 90s, and I remembered it had been pretty bad for them at the time. I tracked them down and I listened to their stories. I talked to friends. I talked to friends of friends. I tracked down complete strangers whose blogs I had read, and sometimes they were alive, but often they weren't. Now, you should know that I did not judge the credibility of these stories, and I came across some real doozies. I was simply on a story gathering mission. And at the end of the day, I had a laundry list of all the ways that people had survived. And when I spent time with this laundry list, looking at it, examining it, discarding things that didn't seem credible or practical or affordable, these themes emerged. And they were many of the things that we all know about and have heard about. They were things like diet and exercise and changing your life in some dramatic way, like following your dreams and passions and your heart's desire, or leaving abusive situations, things like that. And I used the themes from these stories as a reference point, and I plotted my way out of the darkness, holding on to people's stories. And you know what? It worked. Something worked. I blew past every single one of my scary markers, first year out, second year out, 5 years out, 10 years out last year. It was a big deal. Thank you. Thank you. So at some point, my oncologist, who had battled me tooth and nail on some of the things that I did, said to me, listen, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it. And I realized that what I had been doing was holding on for dear life to other people's stories. And that is when I gave myself permission to tell my own stories. So, one of the toughest things that tortured me the most when I thought my days were numbered were all the things that I hadn't done, that I had wanted to do, that I hadn't had the courage to do, the excuses that I had made, and the perfection that I had been looking for. I remember once I had been hand-wringing to my husband about wanting to be a writer, and he said, listen, just start a blog and just write for yourself. And I said, listen, I don't want to write for myself. I want to write for other people. I had these very specific conditions that I was going to write under, and that's how it was going to be. Well, when I thought I was going to die, I started the blog. And a really funny thing happened, because here I was, bald and emaciated, and I had no power and no influence over anything, not my health, not my destiny, some days not even whether I could get off the sofa. But whatever energy that I had, I took and I focused on the tiny bit of space that I had power over. Every single day, I showed up on my blog and I told my stories. And that's when the strangest thing happened for me. That little bit of power that I had began to expand. People started showing up every day to read my pieces. They would read and they would comment. They would send me private messages. A couple of months in, there were some editors commenting. A few more months in, a couple of literary agents had. And halfway through the year, I had this really crazy incident where somebody stole a purse out of my car, my purse. And you know, I had been so powerless at that point that it felt so personal to me that this guy who didn't know me from Adam had taken my purse out of my car that was unlocked in my driveway. Well, I tracked him down using social media. Listen, it was a really good story, but looking back at it, it was a little psycho. But man, don't come after the purse of a bald, skinny woman with nothing to lose and 0 fucks left to give. So the guy was caught, and it was one of the first examples of social media being used to catch a criminal instead of preying on people. So I wrote about it, and the piece went viral. Gave me hope. The influence and the power expanded a little. A few months after that, CNN ran a series that I had written about my cancer experience. I had written it on my blog first, and someone had seen it, sent it to this editor, and the pieces did really well. And Mary Carter from Atlanta, who was the managing editor for CNN Health at that time, went on to assign me more stories, mostly about stress. So eventually, she offered me a column called Seeking Serenity, and I'm going to tell you this story that I wasn't going to tell. But she asked me what I wanted when I first started writing for her, and I told her that I wanted a column. And she laughed for a long time, and she said, listen, everybody wants a column. Like, what do you really want? And I said, I want a column. I put my stake in the ground. So 2 months after that, she gave me a column. So never be afraid of what you ask for and anchor high. So the funny thing is that when Mary eventually did come back to ask me to write the column, she said, listen, we're taking CNN Health in this new direction, and we're going to focus on sex, sleep, and stress. And we have sex and sleep covered, so we want you to cover stress. And I kid you not, I actually said to her, but I don't know anything about stress. So CNN and the Seeking Serenity column gave me access to the minds of the best researchers and practitioners on stress and well-being. I wrote the column for years on top of my day job, and then it went on to become a book by the same name that came out a couple of years ago. So, thank you. So y'all, I wrote the book on stress, and also many, many articles, and I'm going to just give you some cliff notes today. Would you like some cliff notes on stress? So if there's one thing that you need to take away from today, it's that there is no such thing as stress-free living. There just isn't. All of life is stimulus, and it knocks you out of balance, it knocks you out of equilibrium. You will stop stressing only when you die. And the other thing is that not all stress is bad, and your stories about stress really matter in the way that they impact you. So if you think that all stress is bad, it's all going to impact you in a bad way. Stress actually falls across a spectrum from good to bad, with tolerable stress forming the shades of gray in between. Good stress helps you recover faster from surgery. It makes your heart beat faster as you lean in for a kiss. It helps you give a good speech, maybe. Lets you take good exams. The problem is the bad stress. It's the chronic, toxic stress. So I want you to hold up your hand like this with your fingers closed together like this. So most of us are going through life stressing like this, going from peaks of stress to peak to peak to peak. This is toxic. Now open your hands. This is how you should be stressing, from peaks to valleys, peaks to valleys, peaks to valleys. It's okay if you're stressed out and overwhelmed sometimes, as long as you're building in those valleys. And we are running our lives like this. We're running our families like this, our children like this. We're running our teams and our departments like this. Hell, some of us are even running our vacations like this. Seriously. So this is the most pervasive type of bad stress. It's basically exhaustion, it's burnout, and it's going to kill you. All of the research says that. And it's how we're living. And let's talk about the valleys for a minute. Don't look for perfection in the valleys. Take vacations, yes, absolutely, but also any and all downtime. Establish wide open spaces, sacred spaces, both within and without, free of distractions. Allow yourself the time to create, to imagine, to put things together and simply be. 20 minutes of meditation, an hour in nature, 10 minutes of walking, cuddling a pet, a minute breathing in a dark room, listening to one song. And here's a tip. Turn off the devices. Really, turn them off. And the final thing I will tell you about stress, which is something that I get both from my work as a stress researcher and my work as a consultant, working to create culture out in the world, create new cultures out in the world. This is the lesson that I have learned where the two intersect. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti, he said that it is not a measure of good health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. The counterintuitive thing about stress is that in an era of great trials and adversities where so many of our institutions and belief systems are collapsing around us every single day now, stress is one of the best guides we have on how to design new, better, thriving cultures and organizations and families that really serve all of us. Remember the key to post-traumatic growth? Optimism. It's seeing setbacks and bad events as transient, temporary, and changeable. It's telling really good stories about what's happening to us and what has happened to us and what it might lead to. And it's not a version of optimism that denies pain and misery, but a version that acknowledges the suffering, that's perfectly aware of what we're going through and what the stakes are, but that continues to tell good stories that propel us forward. It's optimism with a plan. So I want to tell you something. I remember those days of revolution when I was a child. And I look at everything that is unfolding around us every day, all the news, the events, the stories, the setbacks, the developments, and I can tell you that I have been here before and that we are living in revolutionary times, radically important times. And if you look closely enough, you will see that everything that is happening right now, everything, the good and the bad, is in service to the same fundamental question. Who gets to belong? How do we create high-performing, impactful, inclusive cultures that serve all of us, where everybody can be seen, where everybody can be heard, and where everybody can thrive? Our stories matter. Our stories become our roadmaps, and we, writers and designers and communicators and storytellers and creators, we are on the front line of telling new stories that can help us build new communities and families and companies. And diverse perspectives are fundamental to this because they uncover your shadow spots. And Black and brown women, hear me, because I am speaking to us here. Because our unique perspectives allow us to see what others can't and allow us to hear what others can't. We are the ones that can take all of these building blocks of everyday pain and glory and devastation and wonder and weave them into these beautiful narratives of possibility and what can be and what should be. It is our responsibility to not step away, but to step forward. Building inclusive, diverse communities is hard, and it's nuanced work, and it's messy work, and it makes people really, really uncomfortable, and it isn't always easy to measure, but it is the only way forward because there's just no going back to where we were before. And why would we want to? Because innovation thrives, and the future is where thrives, where people embrace ambiguity, where we redefine creativity, and where we invite everyone to co-create the path forward. And I want to close with words that I invoke and I think about every single time I feel really helpless, when there's a setback, when I realize how far we have yet to go, when something horrifying happens again, and when I realize how impossible the odds seem. Nelson Mandela said, "It is impossible, and then it is done." Thank you.